That morning, when Lucas, the new chief data officer, barely 34, with the confidence of someone who had just finished a self help book, leaned against my office doorway and said that an intern could do what I do, I did not get angry. The only thing I felt was a flicker of surprise, not because the remark was rude, but because it was naive. It is always fascinating when someone who has never raised even a single dollar believes he understands the work of someone who has spent 20 years doing exactly that. I sat at the desk that had followed me for more than a decade, in a small office overlooking the corner of the hospital park. This nonprofit hospital had been my second home for nearly half my life, going back to when I was young and clumsy, learning how to send thank you letters at just the right moment, memorizing which donor preferred, which flowers, which tea, or who only needed a short holiday call to feel remembered. I am the Senior Director of Donor Relations. It is not a loud title, but it is the heartbeat of this institution. Without donors, there is no hospital. It is as simple as that. For 20 years, I learned to understand them not through spreadsheets, but through their lives. These were people who stayed with us through recessions, harsh winters, family emergencies, and losses that changed them forever. Their giving did not come from marketing campaigns or quarterly reports. It came from trust in the familiar face they had known for years. That is why many of them saw me not as hospital staff, but as part of the very thing they were supporting. Lucas did not understand that, or did not care to. He arrived just as leadership decided the hospital needed a refresh. A fresh business degree, startup experience, and a vocabulary full of words like automation, funnels, dashboards, all worn like armor. To Lucas, the world ran on data. People were nothing more than predictable behavior patterns if you use the right tools. I do not deny the value of technology, but I also know some things cannot be reduced. Trust is one of them. I looked at Lucas standing there with his steaming latte, eyes filled with the certainty of a man convinced he had discovered a simple solution to a complex problem. In that moment, I did not see him as an adversary. I saw him as someone walking into a land he did not realize his map was wrong for. Then I thought of my daughter, Sarah, 17, sharp, principled, the reason I stayed in this field for so long. She wants to be a doctor, a beautiful dream and a hard one too. She grew up with my stories about the hospital, the scholarship program, the donors who helped build the emergency room, or quietly paid medical bills for children who had nowhere else to go. She often asked me why I was not appreciated more. I always laughed it off because that is not an easy thing to explain to a teenager who sees right and wrong in clean lines. But she was right. I never demanded respect, but I always noticed when it was missing. And that morning, it was missing clearly in one sentence from Lucas. I asked him whether he was sure he understood my work. My voice was calm, without challenge or sarcasm, just a simple question. Lucas laughed, louder than necessary, as if mistaking my question for encouragement. He replied with absolute confidence that in this age, technology could handle almost everything. The implication was obvious. Relationships, loyalty, years of human connection were old, outdated, replaceable. I did not argue. First, because arguing with someone who does not understand context is pointless. Second, because I did not need to convince him. I only needed to listen to understand exactly what I was standing in front of. There are moments in life when you realize a chapter is closing. For me, it was not the disrespect. It was the small crack of sound in my mind as Lucas walked away, heading down the hallway as if he had accomplished something important. It sounded like someone trying to snap a large branch without knowing it carried decades of rings they could never break. When I looked back out the window at the sky, I understood something clearly, that what happened was not just a casual insult. It was the first signal that the hospital was moving in a direction where everything I had built might no longer be valued, not because it was not good, but because it was not fashionable enough for the new guard. I am telling you this part because it is the opening piece to everything that came after. Sometimes a sentence that sounds harmless becomes the turning point of an entire life, and usually the person who says it never realizes the weight it carries. Before I go on, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from? Texas, Florida, or somewhere across the ocean. I have always been curious about the time zones of people who have been underestimated, because if anyone has ever told you that your job could be done by anyone, then you understand the feeling of standing in front of someone who refuses to see the value you spent a lifetime building. Lucas believed one sentence could replace 2 decades of experience. I do not know if he heard the small crack of that branch, but I did, loud and clear. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, the internal phone on my desk rang. The voice of the human resources assistant came through, flat and practiced, the tone of someone who has said this line far too many times in her career. Emily, please come down to the small conference room next to the elevator. I knew that room well. Anyone who has worked at this hospital long enough knows it. It is where silent goodbyes happen, where the air conditioner is never turned on so people will leave faster, and where no one ever walks in unless they absolutely have to. I stood, fastened the button on my blazer, and walked down the long hallway. A few colleagues glanced at me and then quickly returned to their screens, as if even an accidental look in this moment might be something they should not risk. When I reached the door, I took a slow breath, not to prepare myself, but to remember the feeling. Seeing a storm coming is always gentler than being struck by it. Inside sat Human Resources and Lucas. The chairs were angled slightly, as if they had spent the entire day adjusting them to the perfect distance. Human Resources began with the carefully trained tone they always use. Emily, thank you for coming. We want to discuss the organization's new direction. I sat down, hands resting lightly on my lap, back straight, not crossing my arms, not showing any sign of defense. I wanted to hear exactly how far they intended to go. Human Resources reviewed her folder and launched into the 3 phrases anyone in this kind of workplace knows by heart: restructuring, streamlining, focusing on the new generation. All of it wrapped in cellophane, soft to the ear, but sharp enough to cut. Lucas sat beside her, wearing the serious expression of someone eager to prove he was ushering the institution into a brave new era. He avoided meeting my eyes, as if worried I might see the uncertainty hiding beneath his confidence. Finally, Human Resources slid a white envelope toward me. This is your severance package, along with the transition timeline and related benefits. I looked at the envelope without opening it. In moments like these, most people ask why, try to negotiate, or at least react. But the only thing I felt was a strange quiet, like the surface of a lake the moment the wind stops. I asked just one question: will I receive my employment contract and all accompanying addenda? Human Resources seemed slightly surprised, but nodded. Of course, we will send everything to you. If they expected tears or pleading, they had chosen the wrong person. I never beg anyone to keep me somewhere. They have already decided I no longer have value. Respect cannot be requested. It can only be given. The meeting ended in 10 minutes, long enough for them to satisfy procedural obligations, short enough to show they wanted me gone quickly. I left the room without looking back. The door clicked shut behind me, a small sound, but just enough to mark the end of a long chapter of my life. Back in my office, I began packing my things. There was not much, because I never kept clutter, but there were a few items whose value was invisible to anyone else. A photograph of me, with a donor who had passed away, the man who funded the end-of-life care program I managed. We took that picture on an autumn afternoon, right after he told me he saw me as a daughter. That photo is a quiet certificate of the work I have done, the kind no spreadsheet can quantify. I placed the photo in the box. Then the handwritten letters from donors, each with its own script, each envelope carrying a story. Last was the file I kept in my locked drawer. Inside was my employment contract and Addendum 4.3. I took it out, set it on the desk, and ran my fingers along the edge of the paper, worn from time. It was the silent shield I had fought to include years ago, when a former executive tried to move all the donors I managed to another team to save money. I refused to sign the new contract until that addendum was added. I turned on my computer one last time and saw the small, sticky note I had left from last year. Written in black marker were the words, Check 4.3. A reminder even I had forgotten, now appearing at the most perfect moment. I packed my personal laptop into my bag, locked the drawer, and stood up. When I walked out of my office, I did not feel left behind. If anything, I felt as though I had just placed a quiet but definitive period at the end of a long sentence. That evening, Sarah was waiting at the dinner table. She noticed I was home earlier than usual and immediately asked, "What happened at the hospital, Mom?" I told her the truth, without embellishing, without dramatizing. I simply said the hospital had decided to change direction, and I was no longer part of that plan. Sarah set her fork down right away. "How could they do that? You gave your whole life to that place." Her eyes were full of anger, and for a moment I saw my own younger self in her. But I did not want her to carry that feeling through her life. I smiled softly. "Sweetheart, people can say whatever they believe. As for me, I believe in paperwork." She fell quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you all right?" I nodded. "I am. Because sometimes you have to leave for people to notice the space that they thought did not matter." Later that night, after Sarah went to bed, I sat alone in the living room with my contract and addendum spread out before me. I read every line slowly, as if revisiting a story I had written long ago, and was only now reaching the turning point. The more I read, the clearer it became that the people in that conference room had no idea what they had touched. What Lucas did not know was that I had once fought tooth and nail for Clause 4.3, and it was about to become more valuable than gold. A few days after the afternoon, I walked out of the small conference room next to the elevator, and the first messages from former colleagues began to come in. No one said directly that they missed me, but openers like, "Hey Emily, let me tell you this," were enough to show things were not going smoothly. Lucas had launched his reforms immediately, at a speed even I had to admit was one of his strengths. Fast. Fast enough to skip understanding what he was touching. He called the new program Digital Donor Engagement, a groundbreaking strategy, at least the way he presented it in the department-wide meeting. My friend in development told me the opening slide said, "The future is digital." I could picture the scene and imagined about 1/3 of the room raising their eyebrows. Not because they disagreed, but because they knew the upcoming webinar audience was not a group of startup founders, but people who still read printed letters and morning newspapers. Under Lucas's plan, every private meeting would be replaced by scheduled webinars. Every handwritten thank you letter would be replaced by mass marketing emails written by an outside agency. And most remarkable of all was the new task assigned to the interns, sending LinkedIn messages to donors, including an 82-year-old man who used LinkedIn only to look at pictures of his grandson. When I read my colleague's description, I let out a soft laugh. Not a mocking one, but the kind you release when you already know what comes next. Donors at that age do not hate technology. They hate being treated like an anonymous data file. And it happened faster than I expected. One evening, a friend sent me a screenshot of an email that had just gone out from the new system. The first line read clearly, "Dear insert name here, thank you for your lifelong generosity." I read it again to make sure it was not an edited joke. It was not. It was real, sent to a donor who had a habit of printing every email for his records. The reaction was quiet but deep. He did not get angry. He simply called the office and asked one gentle question. "I would like to know if insert name here is my new name." A calm question, sharper than any accusation. Lucas probably saw it as a technical error, but my colleague said that afternoon the development office was so silent you could hear the printer working. No one dared speak loudly, because everyone knew this was not a system failure. It was a sign the system did not understand people. Meanwhile, I sat in my living room, reading my contract and addenda under the warm yellow lamp. Addendum 4.3 was still there, with the wording I had fought for years to include. Mosaic Pathway is the independent intellectual property of Emily Carter. The hospital may use it only through an annual license. The license automatically expires on the termination date of the employment contract. The expiration date aligned perfectly with the day they escorted me out. I reread each section, remembering the years spent building Mosaic Pathway. Not in conference rooms, not on blank documents, but from hundreds of real conversations. Simple questions like, "How are you feeling today?" The hours spent listening to donors talk about a late spouse. The stories that shaped why they wanted to give. Mosaic Pathway was built from pieces that genuine pieces. Each piece is a story, a detail, something no outsider could ever know from a CSV file. That is why it cannot be copied. People can imitate structure, but they cannot imitate the honesty of relationships built over the years. Just as I was noting down clauses, Sarah came downstairs. She brought a cup of hot tea, the familiar herbal scent drifting gently across the room. She set it in front of me and sat beside me, her eyes carrying the mix of anger and innocence unique to someone young who has not yet built tolerance for injustice. Mom, do you regret it? Sarah asked softly, but her voice did not waver. I looked at the steaming cup, then at her. No. People only regret when they are unprepared. And I was very prepared. I did not say it to comfort her, it was simply the truth. Sarah rested her head on my shoulder, quiet for a moment before saying, "He looks like the kind of person who thinks everything can be copied and pasted." I laughed. Children have a strange way of being right. I placed my hand on the stack of documents, feeling every word in Addendum 4.3 as if it were glowing. I knew the hospital might try to replicate Mosaic Pathway, or at least what they believed Mosaic Pathway was. But they could only copy the surface. The rest, the core, was not on any document, because they did not have its password. About 1 week after the insert name here email became the story everyone in development whispered about, my phone vibrated. I was making coffee, and Sarah was sitting at the dining table, legs tucked onto the chair the way she always did when she was concentrating. When I saw the caller ID, I froze for a few seconds. Donor A, 78 years old, the man who had been calling me dear since I was 30, and never once said it without warmth. "Are you doing okay, dear?" His voice came through slow and gentle, just as it always had. A simple question, layered with more care than anyone who sees donors as spreadsheet entries would ever understand. I told him I was fine, resting, and that sometimes resting is the right choice. He sighed. "I received a strange email from the hospital. It did not sound like you. It did not sound like anyone. They also sent me a link for a webinar. My grandson had to open it for me. I pictured him in his armchair, squinting at an old laptop screen. Something about it was both funny and quietly sad. I did not badmouth the hospital, nor did I need to. I simply reminded him that he had the right to invoke the key person clause he had insisted be added to his agreement years ago. I said it gently, the way you might remind a friend that their umbrella is still in the trunk. He understood immediately. Thank you, dear. I know what to do." When the call ended, I returned to the table. My coffee had gone half cold. I felt no joy, no triumph. What I felt was like watching a door close. Quiet, unhurried, irreversible. 2 days later, I received a scanned letter. Donor A formally ended his funding, citing the key person clause. He CC'd me with a short line, "Thank you for everything." I read it twice. What struck me was not the content, but the certainty. Older donors do not make decisions like this out of anger. They act when they believe the organization has lost something more important than money: respect. That same afternoon, a former colleague messaged me. "Emily, they called an emergency meeting. Development feels like it is standing on thin ice. The room is dead silent." Someone said the operations director turned pale when he saw the email. Losing someone like Donor A is not losing a budget line. It is pulling out the first stone of an arch. The truth proved itself faster than I expected. The next morning, Donor B sent a termination letter. One formal page, no complaints, no accusations, no bitterness. Just an ending, after receiving what they described as messages lacking human warmth. They CC'd me and added one line, "We hope you are well." I opened the email and felt something settle inside me. Not sadness, not joy, just the recognition of inevitability, the way you know rain will fall on the day destined for rain. Sarah walked by, saw my expression, and stopped. "Did you lose another donor, Mom?" I nodded. She frowned. "It is not your fault." I know, I smiled. But hearing it from you still helps. Then came Donor C, and that one was even simpler. No calls, no explanations, no circling the point. Just a letter with a single sentence, "Without Emily, our philanthropy will find another home." One sentence, and yet it flicked a switch. Clean, sharp, final. 3 donors in 1 week. Three funding pillars hold up essential programs. If you have never worked in a nonprofit, you cannot understand the magnitude of that impact. But anyone who has worked in the field only needs to hear the number of donors to feel the weight. I opened my laptop and created a new folder, Documentation in Case. I saved every letter, every CC'd email, every contract, every scanned copy of Clause 4.3. I was not collecting them to fight back. I collected them because after so many years in this world, I knew nothing truly exists unless it is written down. Sarah came over and sat next to me, her elbow resting on the table. "What are you going to do next?" Her voice was calmer now, like she was trying to understand the whole picture. "I do not know yet," I said. Then I looked at her. Or maybe I do. Maybe I just have not said it out loud. She studied me for a moment, then asked, "Why are you not reacting more strongly?" "When people are wrong, they should be told they are wrong." I placed my hand on hers. "Sweetheart, the biggest reaction is no reaction. Silence forces people to listen to themselves, and sometimes what they hear bothers them more than anything I could have said." She did not answer immediately. Then she nodded, as if accepting that some battles are not won with noise, but with patience. That night, after she went upstairs, I sat alone. The documents in the new folder lay neatly in front of me. I looked at each donor letter and realized every one of them was like a snowflake, small, quiet. But when enough of them fall, they can trigger an avalanche. And I knew one thing, as clearly as the signatures on those pages. Losing one donor was only the beginning of the avalanche. News about the three major donors leaving did not take long to reach the upper floors. On Monday morning, not even 8 o'clock yet, a former colleague texted me. The chief executive officer called an emergency meeting. No notice, no schedule. Just a single line in an email with a red subject line. Emergency board session. I was not in that room, but I could see it clearly in my mind. The long wooden table, the expensive chairs, the paper coffee cups set down in a rush, and the faces trying to stay composed, while every pair of eyes quietly turned toward Lucas. The next message from my colleague summed it up. The tension is like a tightened string. Lucas opened the meeting with a report I assumed he had thrown together in a few hours the night before. On his slide, he listed 3 reasons the donors left: economic volatility, market instability, lingering aftershocks of a long pandemic. He spoke smoothly, professionally, with the tone of someone who believed that confidence alone could turn a story into truth. The chief executive officer folded his arms, his expression heavy as stone. A few board members looked only at the papers in front of them, saying nothing. But then one of them, Mr. Marlowe, the oldest member of the board, the man who used to send me handwritten holiday gratitude letters, spoke. His voice was slow but sharp as a blade. "Lucas, the termination letter states the reason very clearly. It says, 'Emily left.'" The room fell silent. I read that line twice in the message, and it echoed even louder through text than it would have in person. No economic cause, no market shift, just a truth almost too simple. They left because the person they trusted was gone. Lucas tried to stay steady, but my colleague said his shoulder twitched. A small reaction, but impossible to hide from people fluent in reading body language. The chief executive officer took a long breath and asked Lucas for concrete solutions. That was when Lucas revealed his new plan, which was really the old plan dressed in a new suit. Revive Mosaic Pathway. Dig through the archived files, copy the scripts I had written, and send emails written in my tone to restore familiarity for donors. When I read that part, I had to sit down. Not because I was shocked, but because everything was unfolding exactly as expected. When people lose direction, they always run back to the old road, even when that road no longer belongs to them. Lucas instructed the development team to retrieve Mosaic Pathway files from the server. They reopened old folders, searched through my notes, and even copied lines from emails I had written for long-term donors. They tried stitching those pieces into an Emily version 2.0, hoping the donors would not notice the difference. But the problem was not the words. The problem was that the Mosaic Pathway license expired the exact day I left the hospital, and any access, usage, or copying after that became an intellectual property violation under the same contract they had signed. What they did not expect was that someone in the information technology department, young Alex, the technician I had helped more than once during server outages, noticed something unusual. He saw mosaic pathway files being opened, copied, edited, and downloaded by multiple internal accounts after the license expiration date, and he knew it could be a serious legal issue. That evening, I received an email from Alex. Emily, I am not sure if you want to see this, but I think you should. Attached were detailed server access logs, including timestamps, usernames, IP addresses, and the names of the files opened. I opened the file, and from the first line, I knew the situation was more serious than they realized. Mosaic Pathway Master accessed 10:42 in the morning. Mosaic Scripts. Original accessed 11:05 in the morning. Template Emily version copied at 11:17 in the morning. And the list continued through the entire morning. Sarah walked up behind me just as I was reading. She looked at the screen, then at me. What do they think they are doing, Mom? I smiled softly, not out of amusement, but with the quiet certainty of someone watching the wheel of consequence begin to turn. They are signing more paperwork for me. They just do not know it yet. Her eyes widened. Sarah understood more law than she realized, but hearing that made her pull up a chair beside me. I pointed to one timestamp in particular, 2:13 in the afternoon. The account belonging to Lucas R. opened the Mosaic Pathway full license, the same file I had left on the server with a very clear title, but apparently no one truly read it until today. What I felt in that moment was not revenge, not victory. It was the calm anticipation of someone watching a film reach the point where the music quiets, the frame tightens, and everyone knows the climax is coming. I leaned back in my chair, crossed my arms, and let my eyes rest on that timestamp. A small detail, but the one detail everything revolved around. And the moment I saw it, I knew. The reel was about to switch to the best part. That afternoon, while I was slicing fruit for Sarah in the kitchen, my phone rang. The screen showed a hospital number, but not the main line. It was an internal extension from the executive floor. I wiped my hands on a towel, answered, and waited. The chief executive officer's voice came through without greeting, without courtesy, and without attempting to hide the frustration leaking between his breaths. Emily, you need to come back immediately. The organization is in crisis, and if you do not cooperate, the legal department will have to intervene. I leaned against the counter and looked out the window. The sky was so blue that day, it made me wonder whether he had meant to call someone else. But no, his words were meant for me. A familiar tone, the kind used by people who are accustomed to demanding, not requesting. He continued, quicker now, sharper now. You must return to hand things over, assist donors, provide documentation. Your obligations are still in effect. We need you. The organization needs you. I let him finish. I did not correct him. I did not interrupt. I did not offer explanations he had not earned. I simply listened to the voice of a man who had begun to realize he had broken something he believed unbreakable. When he finally paused, waiting for my response, I spoke softly, as light as air. Of course. Let us read the contract together. The silence on the other end was immediate, not the silence of agreement, the silence of someone who suddenly felt his earlier threats drifting in the wrong direction. I repeated, clearer this time. I will arrange a formal meeting. With you, with Lucas, with Human Resources, with the General Counsel, and with one member of the board. Both sides should have witnesses. He exhaled sharply as if the idea offended him. But in the end, he said, fine, send me the time. When I hung up, Sarah was standing in the kitchen doorway, her notebook still in her hand. She looked at me with wide eyes, the kind you see on young people who realize a moment might shift the entire landscape. Mom, what did they just say? I sliced another piece of apple, handed it to her, and said, they want me to come back, not in the most polite way. She set her notebook down and stepped closer. Are you stressed? I feel like you have had too much to deal with lately. I smiled. Sweetheart, I do not fight with anger. I fight with paperwork and logic. She blinked, then laughed, even though she was not entirely sure she understood the full meaning. That evening, After dinner, I sat at the table and opened the wooden box where I kept important documents. My breathing steady, my hands calm, my mind quiet. People think preparing for confrontation means tension, but in this case, calmness was the advantage. I laid everything out. First was the original contract, its ink slightly smudged at the corner from the day I signed it years ago. I ran my fingers along the edge of the paper and remembered the exact moment I demanded additional protection. They called me meticulous back then. Turns out meticulous is sometimes the only way to survive. Next came Addendum 4.3, the clause they feared most, yet had never truly read. Line by line, it affirmed Mosaic Pathway as my intellectual property, licensed annually, expiring the moment my employment ended. I tilted the page under the lamp to see the old lawyer's signature clearly. Beautiful, clean, deliberate, the kind of signature written by someone who fully understood what he was signing. Then the annual Mosaic Pathway licenses, organized neatly out of habit, each one with precise dates, each one with the hospital's signature, each one showed the expiration aligning exactly with the day they escorted me out. Then I placed the server access logs from Alex on the table, rows of timestamps unfolding minute by minute, telling a story I would likely have to recount the next day. Unauthorized access, copied content, and opened license files unread. I looked at them the way you look at a map. Every dot leads to the same place. Finally, the donor letters. Donor A's formal tone. Donor B's wish for my well-being. Donor C's single sentence closes a door. I placed them together in a separate stack. No evidence against anyone. Evidence of a truth. Who they trusted and who they did not. Sarah appeared again with a cup of hot tea. She did not ask anything this time. She just set it down and leaned over the table. She whispered, "This looks like you are getting ready for court." I laughed softly. "No need for court, sweetheart. All they need to do is read their own signatures." I gathered everything, stacked it with the precision of habit, and placed the documents into a brown leather folio I used for important meetings. I pulled the zipper closed, hearing the quiet click of metal teeth locking together. It was not to intimidate them. I never needed to intimidate anyone. It was simply to remind them that signatures do not lie. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital building a few minutes before the scheduled time. The 12th floor, usually reserved for executive meetings, had never felt foreign to me, but the hallway carried a different atmosphere that day. Cold, dry, still, as if the air conditioning had been set low enough to freeze any emotion before it made it through the door. When I opened the conference room door, everyone was already seated. The chief executive officer sat at the head of the table, trying and failing to mask the tension in his face. Human Resources pressed herself against the wall, her hands twisting beneath the table. Lucas leaned back slightly, shoulders locked, even as he attempted a polite smile. The general counsel, Mr. Bernstein, was the only one not pretending. His eyes went straight to the leather folio in my hand, as if he already knew exactly what was inside. I took my seat and set the folio gently on the table. No one spoke for the first few seconds. I realized they were waiting for me to begin. Interesting, I thought. The person they once said could be replaced by an intern was now the one expected to open the meeting. I nodded and said calmly, "Let us review the contract together, as agreed." I opened the folio and laid out the contract and its addenda. The white LED lights angled over the paper, making every line of ink appear sharper. I placed Addendum 4.3 in front of them. First, I want to clarify the Mosaic Pathway. Lucas shifted in his chair, as if he sensed what was coming but still hoped he was wrong. I continued. Mosaic Pathway is clearly listed in this addendum as an employee-originated methodology. And what does that mean? It means the methodology was developed independently before I joined the organization. The hospital does not own it. The hospital only receives a yearly license to use it. This license is renewed through an annual signed agreement, and I pointed to the line written plainly. The license expired on the exact day my employment ended. I paused long enough for the words to settle. Lucas leaned forward and rushed out. That does not mean you can stop the hospital from using files that already exist on our server. Internal data belongs to the general counsel raised a hand, silencing him. Then he read aloud, word for word, with the tone of someone delivering a ruling. Ownership remains with the employee-originated account holder. License is limited, non-transferable, and expires upon termination of employment unless renewed by both parties. He finished, lifted his eyes, and looked around the table. It seemed obvious that no one in leadership had actually read that section when they signed it. I continued. Because the license has expired, any access, copying, or use of Mosaic Pathway materials after that date constitutes infringement. Lucas opened his mouth, but the chief executive officer placed his hand on the table. A small gesture, heavy enough to silence him. I turned to the next document. My termination was not due to performance. Human Resources documented that clearly. Therefore, under Clause 5.2, all non-compete restrictions related to my donor list are void. I said the word void gently without raising my voice. The chief executive officer frowned. You are saying you can continue working with them immediately, I answered. Not only can I have already been invited, and the law allows it. The room tightened like an overstrung violin. But that was not the most important part. I placed the server access logs on the table, the same ones Alex had sent me the night before. The first timestamp almost glowed under the light. Mosaic Pathway Master, accessed 10:42 in the morning, after the end of my employment. The general counsel lifted the document, scanning each line. He read it once, then again slower, as if confirming nothing had been misread. The chief executive officer leaned back, arms crossed. His face softened in the way a person's face softens when every threat they made the night before begins folding back toward them. Human Resources kept her chin tucked down, unable to look up. Lucas was the first to break the silence. This is not enforceable. No court penalizes a hospital for maintaining donor relationships. No one. The general counsel did not let him finish. He set the log down with a sound soft but sharp enough to slice through the room. It is enforceable, and you signed on page 3. Silence fell again. This time it was not fear. It was recognition. My phone vibrated just then. I glanced at the screen. A message from Sarah. Mom, stay calm. You've got this. I let out a small laugh, just enough for myself. I turned off the screen, placed the phone beside the folio, and looked around the room. I continued clearly, without challenge, without theatrics. Under Clause 6.4, any attempt to compel my return after termination without a legitimate performance-based reason triggers mandatory compensation. 3 times the value of the past 12 months of donor commitments under my portfolio. Human Resources looked up, lips trembling. 3 times. I nodded. Yes. That figure was negotiated 7 years ago, after I was intentionally excluded from a major contract. The hospital's former attorney advised adding this clause for my protection. And he did an excellent job. The silence that followed was heavier than the previous ones. This silence sounded like a system finally being forced to listen to the consequences of its own signatures. I turned to the final set of documents, the letters from the 3 major donors. No accusations, no anger, just withdrawal, clearly citing personnel changes as the cause. I did not read them aloud. I did not need to. Each page spoke for itself. I gathered the documents, aligned them neatly, then reached into the folio and placed 2 envelopes on the table. Items they had not expected, but were undoubtedly afraid to imagine. I said, we still have a few options to discuss. I set the envelopes down slowly, deliberately, simply. In that moment, the room grew so silent I could almost hear the thin stream of cold air slipping under the door. A draft sharp enough to feel, but devoid of anything human. The 12th floor conference room was still as cold as when I first walked in, but something had shifted, not the temperature, the direction of their eyes. Once the 2 envelopes landed on the table, everyone understood the conversation was no longer about mistakes. It was about consequences. I placed my hand on the first envelope. This is option A. I spoke clearly, without raising my voice, yet each word fell with just enough weight to hold their attention. Under option A, I will return, or more accurately, I will return as an independent consultant for 12 months. Payment upfront. No net 30. No delays. I turned to the chief executive officer. He did not blink, but the slight flare of his nostrils revealed the silent math happening in his mind. Additionally, you will accept Lucas's resignation, effective immediately. I am not saying this to injure anyone. I am saying it because the truth is that the donors did not leave due to some invisible storm. They left due to specific decisions made by a specific person. Lucas snapped his head toward me, his face flushed, as if I had slapped him with the contract itself. But he did not interrupt. He no longer had the standing to. Furthermore, the hospital will issue an internal apology letter not to humiliate anyone, but to clarify for the staff where the line of disrespect lies. And a second letter will be sent to the donors, acknowledging the errors and stating that the previous process will be restored under my professional oversight. I opened the envelope and placed a sheet on the table. The Mosaic Pathway License. A 12-month renewal. License fee, triple the previous amount. Payable immediately. This time, the chief executive officer leaned back in his chair, unable to hide his reaction. His eyes flicked toward the general counsel, asking silently, "Can we survive this number?" Mr. Bernstein did not answer. He simply folded his hands, the posture of someone who has witnessed too many self-inflicted crises. I closed the first envelope, then placed my hand on the second one. And this is option B. No one moved. No one breathed deeply. I opened the envelope and arranged the papers neatly on the table. Option B is simpler, but it hurts more. If option A gives you a headache, option B will give you a heart attack. Under option B, I will join another hospital system. The offer was sent to me last week. And because the non-compete is void, as you already know, donors may follow whenever they choose. I looked directly at the chief executive officer as I said it. He did not look away, but his eyes retreated half a step, as if one of his own heartbeats had stumbled. Second, this hospital will be obligated to pay the penalty triggered by the clause, 3 times the value of the past 12 months of donor commitments under my portfolio. Third, the Mosaic Pathway infringement fees. Not a gentle number. The chief executive officer froze. For a moment, his expression shifted into one I had seen only once. Before, the year the hospital lost a major contract, and he had to call the finance team past midnight. The face of someone who has realized that the actions of a small group can shake an entire institution. The general counsel let out a slow sigh, the kind that comes from knowing every exit door has been locked by the signatures of the people now seeking an escape. I added one final line. The deadline for option B is Friday at 5 in the evening. The room went silent again. I could feel their minds moving even though their bodies did not. The atmosphere was like an X-ray room, still, but bright enough to illuminate the bone beneath the surface. Lucas was the first to speak. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is extortion." I tilted my head, polite enough not to escalate, sharp enough to let him know the accusation had missed its mark entirely. I turned gently to the general counsel. "Do you have a more accurate legal term?" Mr. Bernstein clasped his hands and looked at Lucas as if he were a first-year student beginning a paper on the wrong topic. "This is not extortion. This is contractual liability, and we signed it on page 3. Short. Precise. The end of that argument." Lucas collapsed back into his chair, stripped of the confidence he once believed could command the room. Human Resources bent lower, as if hoping the table might swallow her. The chief executive officer laced his fingers together to hide the tremor he assumed I would not notice. I said nothing more. I did not need to. Everything was already on the table. 2 envelopes, 2 paths, 2 different kinds of pain. Silence stretched for a few seconds, like a pause waiting for someone to end the scene. No one did. No one dared. I closed the folio and lifted my eyes to take in the entire room. They looked back and forth between option A and option B, as if weighing 2 forms of suffering, the one that aches and the one that shatters. And I did not intervene, because the choice never belonged to me. It belonged to the people who once believed I could be replaced by an intern. When I closed the folio and stood, the 12th floor meeting ended without anyone announcing its end. It was the kind of silence you only hear in institutions that once believed they controlled everything, right up until the moment they realized their own signatures had opened the door to this outcome. The next day, I received an email from the chair of the board. Not long, not dramatic, Only one sentence. We select option B. No apology, no explanation, just acceptance. Acceptance so costly it became a confession they did not need to write out loud. The compensation was transferred into my account on time without a single minute of delay. The Mosaic Pathway infringement fee was paid in full as well. I read the transaction confirmation while Sarah prepared breakfast, and when I exhaled softly, she turned and asked, "Mom, are you okay?" I nodded. Better than ever. A few days later, I signed with a new hospital system, a place where the first thing the leader said to me was, "We want you for the value you create, not for the documents you bring." A simple sentence, enough to tell me I had chosen the right place to begin again. And then the thing everyone predicted, except the one person who needed to see it, happened. My donors followed, not loudly, not publicly, no drama, just polite messages. "We appreciate your support, Emily. We trust your stewardship and will continue our philanthropic work under your guidance." I did not encourage them. I did not have to. When trust is built with time, presence, and the moments that actually matter in people's lives, it does not disappear because someone believes it can be replaced with a spreadsheet and a slide deck. 1 week later, Lucas's name vanished from the hospital website. No announcement, no farewell note. Just gone, as if he had never existed there at all. I felt neither joy nor satisfaction. His disappearance was not my victory. It was his consequence. Some lessons are learned only when paid for with a career. That Friday afternoon, after my first full week at the new hospital, I decided to stop by the old one for the last time. Not to provoke, not to admire the aftermath, just to say goodbye to a place where I spent 2 decades, a place that was once home before it became a turning point. I stood in front of the building and looked up at the glass, reflecting the late summer New York sky. The 12th floor lights were still on. Maybe someone was in a meeting. Maybe someone was trying to steady the new set of reports. I looked toward the window where the meeting had taken place the day before. No joy, no anger, just peace. The peace of someone who knows she did what needed to be done and walked away at the moment she was meant to walk. I turned toward the car where Sarah stood waiting, arms open as if I had just finished a marathon she had watched the entire way. "Mom, I always knew you could not be replaced." I smiled and hugged her tightly, not because her words made me proud, but because they reminded me that sometimes your worth does not come from the place you work. It comes from the people who actually know who you are. We got into the car, and as the city moved past the window like a film strip, I thought about everything that had happened, about how one small sentence, a throwaway remark that meant nothing to the person who said it, had triggered a chain of events that forced an entire system to pay the price. That is the thing people in workplaces often forget. The person who cannot be replaced is not the one who works like a machine. The person who cannot be replaced is the one whose work carries a heart you cannot copy or paste. And when organizations ignore real value, they do not just lose an employee, they lose trust, they lose relationships, they lose the foundation they never realized was holding them up. This story, like every story in life, is not meant to teach a lesson. It is simply a reminder that sometimes justice arrives quietly, like a door closing without a sound, only to open another door that is better, brighter, and fairer for the people who deserve it. If you have listened this far, I want to leave you with one last thought. If you enjoy calm but sharp stories like this, a little humorous but full of justice, subscribe to the channel. It is free. And it helps me keep telling stories for the people who have been underestimated, but were never ordinary.